Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Audrey Coleman. I'm Assistant Director and Senior Archivist here at the Institute, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here to our first installment of our 2019 series with the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth today. So you've chosen to spend a beautiful sunny day with us, and so we know that means so much that you've been really looking forward to this series, which is one of our most popular programs, both in person and on our YouTube channel. We very much appreciate the staff at the Department of Military History for sharing these high-quality programs with our audience, and we're excited to begin yet another year with you all. Before we begin our event, I'd like to tell you about an upcoming special exhibit hosted here at the Institute. This Saturday on January 5th, a special installation called The Wall of Respect will open right here in Simon's Media Room. We'll host this interactive opening event for students and families at 11 o'clock a.m. this coming Saturday. The exhibit is hosted in partnership with the Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City, and you can find more information about that installation on your program. After the presentation, we'll have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. I'd also like to remind you on my last opportunity to turn off or silence your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming David Cotter, Director of the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tom Hansen's gift to me before he left was to give me the first one of these. So, Happy New Year. This is the inaugural event. We do this once a month here, and we truly enjoy it. And the theme that we were working with as we came into this year's program was great commanders you've never heard of, or something similar to that. And so the program this year is going to be comprised of some of the more obscure leaders in military history, but just because they're perhaps not as famous as some of the names that jump right to the top of your head, doesn't mean that they're not worth considering. And Slim is certainly one of those. Slim is an officer of great distinction that we do study at the Command and General Staff College, and we study him for his leadership and his generalship, his ability to command under duress, and I'll talk about some of those things today. But up front, you're going to get a paid political advertisement, and the reason for that is at the end of last month's presentation, I was approached by a couple of members of the audience that said, we've heard all about this program, and we know it comes from the Command and General Staff College, but we don't know what the Command and General Staff College is. So I put together a couple of charts here just to talk about that very briefly. I don't want that to mortgage our time with Field Marshal Slim, but I did want to take a couple of minutes to go through that. So that's our building. We're very proud of our building, and we have Senator Pat Roberts to thank for that building. We're very proud of it. There's an old joke that runs around that says, when General Sherman founded the school in 1881, he left and said, "Don't change anything till I get back." Well, the bottom line is nothing could be further from the truth. The Command and General Staff College is a dynamic organization, and it changes to meet the needs of the nation, as you can see here. Today, we really do reflect the joint interagency, whole-of-government approach to national defense. And our student body is comprised of mainly military officers, but also members of the interagency community and about 120 members of the international military community. In 2015, the college became a subordinate organization of the newly formed Army University, which is the enterprise level for all Army professional military education, from basic training to the charm schools that the general officers go to. And we clearly are a big piece of that. When you think of the Command and General Staff College, most folks think of the Command and General Staff School, and that is the school for majors, where about 1,200 majors a year go. They take a year out of the field, and they go to school for a year. It is a professional school. It's a mixture of education and training, and it comes in many modalities. The main one is the resident phase. There are 1,200 officers in that. There are about 2,100 officers in our distance modality at any given time, and there's another 3,000 in the TASS, the Total Army School System, which is generally run by the reserve components, Compos 2 and 3, at sites all over the United States and in Europe, Japan, Korea, etc. We also, the college is also, the second school in the college is SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies. It has a school for majors. It also has a fellowship, the Advanced Strategic Leaders Strategy Program, and the ASP, the Advanced Strategy Planning Policy Program, which is basically a PhD generating program. Those are the two big schools. The School for Command Preparation, the courses there are not as long, but they're key and essential. They're key because it brings commanders and command sergeants major and their spouses into the academy for 2 to 6 weeks, depending on what level they're in, whether they're going in a battalion, brigade, or whatever command. And it gives them a chance to come out of the field, turn off their cell phone, and get ready to go into command. So it's a key piece of the organization as well. The mission, and I would point out to you in both of those, the college mission at the top and the school mission at the bottom, is to educate and train. And there we go. Oh, that's supposed to be hidden. Sorry about that. That was really a paid political advertisement, the history part of it. This is what the core course looks like. Basically, what we have is a foundational course where the officers are brought in out of the field. They get a chance to write a little bit, do some briefing and get critiqued on it, do a little bit of critical thinking without being, criticized too heavily. They can get back into an academic mode. Strategic joint operations, Army doctrine and planning. They learn the military decision-making process at that point and the joint operations planning process, and they apply that in C500. And that's the first half of the year. Parallel to that are two courses, L100, that's the leadership course, and the course that my colleagues and I teach, which is the H100, the Western way of war, if you will. F100 is a force generation. It's how the Army runs. The officers hate it, but it's one of the things they call back home to get more information on later on when they get an assignment in the Pentagon and have to know these things. The Advanced Operations course is the second big chunk of the year, and it's built on the Army's new manual, new operations manual, FM30. And if you look across the top of the chart, you'll see that the first phase is about training and deployment. The second phase is about joint reception, staging, and onward movement and integration. And this is getting into the theater. The third part is defense and posturing to transition to the offense. Module 4 is the offense. Module 5 is transition from the offense, and that is an area of special interest with Lieutenant General Lundy, our boss, because we have a pretty good record of tactical and in some cases operational success. We're not always that great at capitalizing on that and consolidating those gains for strategic decision. And that's what we're trying to get after as we talk to that Module 5 there. This is the credentialing course for the officers. It's what gives them their the imprimatur to go out and be field grade officers. Okay, that's what I got for that's my paid political advertisement. I have a stack of charts that are hidden behind that. Anybody wants to know about the history course or anything more in depth on that course, I'd be happy to let you know. I will tell you that there is a whole block of elective courses that follow that second phase. And the officers are able to finish the year out, basically taking a good deep look at some of the things that they're interested on a personal and professional level. Sir? It's a Department of the Army Central Select Board selects the officers to come here, and it's based on their performance in the field. Okay? Are we good? Okay, so I want to talk about some great captains in British history. And we were talking about this in the hallway, and I bit my tongue. But when we think of great captains in British history, Marlborough comes to mind for many of us. An innovative commander that did some very innovative, well, he was not only an innovative commander, but he was a persistent commander and insisted on discipline in his formation, as did Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Very successful British captain. And, of course, we're all familiar with Bernard Montgomery, who had a very high opinion of himself, and rightfully so. He did some very good things. What we don't frequently think of is some other people that are less in the forefront. And I would argue that Field Marshal William Slim is emblematic of that. And I would tell you that based on some informal investigation with our British liaison officers back at Leavenworth. This is the officer many of the British officers in their professional military education system study. They study him for his leadership style, his leadership capabilities, and how he was able to make things happen against all odds. And that's what we're going to get into today a little bit. I want to spend most of the day talking about his time in the 14th Army in Burma, but I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time giving you some background on this officer, because he's a very interesting guy. Let's go by there. And we're going to start here. He was born in Bristol, England, which is a seaport, a seacoast down near in the southern part of Wales. It's in England, but it's near the southern part of Wales. He came from a lower class background. This is an important consideration. Slim was a lower class individual, and lower class officers generally usually didn't do well in the British Army. He had a second strike against him. He was Catholic. And in the British Army at the time, being Catholic was not going to get you promoted on an accelerated scale. He was born in lower class, but not in poverty. Later on, his life took his father was an ironmonger who ran out of business several times. But at the end, the bottom line for him was he was not languishing in poverty for most of his life. He joined the Birmingham University Officers Training Corps. That's him on the right. And this is kind of interesting. He joined the Birmingham Officers Training Corps, and he wasn't matriculated at the University of Birmingham or at any other university. He just really wanted to be in the Officers Training Program. And you'll notice that the date that he gets promoted to Lance Corporal as a cadet, and serendipitously, or fortuitously, this is linked up with the onset of the First World War. He actually gets commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. That's him in the center. And they go off to Gallipoli, and bad things happen to Slim as they happen to very many other people. And we won't go into Gallipoli. I'll tell you that he ended up getting wounded twice there. He ends up the war with the Military Cross. But he earned a reputation. This is an individual who should never have been commissioned, according to the general rules of the day. He did. He performed very well and was recognized for his performance, and was able to secure a post-war position in the Indian Army. Another thing here, we talked about the class stuff a little bit up front. The British Army operates on a class system too, and the Indian Army is not the first class. The Coldstream Guards are the first class. The Blues and Royals are the first class. The officers serving in the Indian Army are not. They're considered second class. There's a whole history that proves that erroneous, but we don't have time for that here today. He did serve in various positions in the Indian Army, and as you can see, after the First World War, when he's the adjutant of the 1st of the 6th Gurkhas, he is absolutely become a soldier. He is the personification of the soldier. He does go to advanced professional education, and he is named commander of the 1st Battalion of the 6th Gurkhas, and he ultimately ends up, before the outbreak of the war, as the commandant of the senior Army school, and he is promoted to colonel. He's an old colonel. He's probably done, about ready to end his career. Very successful for a low-born Catholic person to make it that high. He did very, very well. But there was a war, and Slim was immediately promoted to brigadier and given command of the 10th Indian Brigade. They went this was an organization in disarray. He put it together. This was sort of a harbinger of things to come. And he was able to take the brigade and fight against the Sudanese army. They met with some success there before he was blown up in his vehicle, his third time he was injured in combat. And he had to go on limited duty for a while and work on staffs until he could heal and recuperate from his injuries. On the 12th of March, 1942, he was promoted to Major General, and he arrives in Burma. He's been handpicked for this by WAVO, and he is identified as a future senior leader. So at this point, I'm doing okay. Slim has been promoted to general officer ranks beyond brigadier. He's a major general. He's in Burma, and this is where the story of the 14th Army really begins. But before we do that, we should really set the strategic setting. What are Japan's war aims here? What is going on, and why is Burma important? The reason Burma is important is because Japan has basically, and to reduce it to very simple terms, Japan's war aim is autarky, economic self-sufficiency. And they need to build an empire. And so one of the things they try to do is they go after this part of the world in 3 phases. The first one is they want to go after China, so they move into the northern part of China into Manchuria, and they take Manchukuo. Then they go to the resource-rich areas down here in the center, and they want British India. And they can't get to India unless you go through Burma first, according to the Japanese war plan, and that's what they did. That was their intent. The Allies always got along together and were always unified in their planning, and so, of course, they had to operate separately. But even in the Pacific, we understand that the U.S. couldn't come. I mean, MacArthur and Nimitz had 2 different plans, and we executed 2 different plans in the Pacific. It's the same way in this theater. The priority for the Americans in this theater is China, keeping China supplied and keeping China in the fight, so that we had to keep Chiang Kai-shek happy. And the British priority, of course, is the protection of India. The common ground here is Burma. And so here we can come to some agreement that we need some common ground, and we can agree that we'll operate together. And so the Southeast Asia Command and Stilwell's American forces are able to come to an agreement to work a little bit together. The only problem with that was their timing was off, and the enemy did have a vote. And in this case, what the Japanese did is they decided they needed Burma more than the Allies were willing to well, they didn't have the capability, as it were, to fight it. And as the Japanese ripped up the Burmese peninsula, if you will, the Chinese were forced to the east and to the north, believe it or not. This is oversimplified here. Stilwell's forces were moved to the north, and the British were forced back into India. The Burma Corps that Slim was in command of, the 17th Division and the 1st Indian Division comprised the Burma Corps, were pushed back roughly. They took significant casualties, but they alone of the British formations arrived back in India intact and in good order. And that was not lost on people. But the bottom line, for those keeping score, is Slim 0, Japanese 1. Okay? I mean, that's where we are in this. He's 0-1 in this fight. So the retreat is into India. The land link to China is severed. Let me go back, see if this is the map I can use. You can see, maybe, the Burma Road here. When the Japanese, that's how the Burma Road ran from Rangoon into China, and that was the main supply route into China. The Japanese attack into Burma severed the Burma Road. So how are we going to get supplies into China now? Becomes the key issue. That land link is severed, and the Bureau, and after the retreat and all the casualties were marshaled, the Burma Corps was disbanded, and the British licked their wounds and they started to assemble some more forces. But it's also important to note that of the priority in this theater, in the Allied fight against the Axis powers in World War II, this theater was an afterthought. The China-Burma-India theater was not that important. It was important to the British, but they didn't have the resources. And so the bottom line is it did not get the resources, the personnel, the people, and the material they needed to prosecute a full-scale war. So they had to consolidate their gains a little bit. In June of '42, Slim is named General Officer Commanding of the 15th Corps, and he gets into a bit of a tete-a-tete with General Noel Irwin, who is the Army commander. Irwin wants an attack on the Arakan Peninsula, and which is the western part of Burma. You may know it from the news today. It's called Rakhine State. It's where the Rohingya are being persecuted. Okay, same place. Anyway, as the General Officer Commanding the 15th Corps, Slim makes it very clear that they are not ready to go fight. He has just begun to put this force together. He has just begun to train them. And Irwin wants him to fight down the Arakan Peninsula. He gets into an argument with Irwin. Irwin has 3 stars. Slim has 2. 3 beats 2. Irwin takes command of the 15th Corps, for all intents and purposes, without taking command of the Corps. and he fights it down, and the 15th Corps is bloodied. Once it's in trouble, Slim is tasked to go down and get the Corps and bring it back in one piece. Slim does that. The dispute between Slim and Irwin has been pretty public, but pretty professional. It wasn't a knockdown, drag-out fight on the parade ground, but it was ugly and known to everybody. And so, after this second defeat of Slim in battle, he is now 0-2. And so the surprising thing that comes out of this, and in the interest of time, I'll just tell you, Irwin was relieved after this event, and Slim was promoted to Army Commander. And again, he's got somebody looking over his shoulder, but he is given command of the 14th Army. When he takes the 14th Army, it consists of a patch and a general. That's what it is. And he has to put this polyglot force together. Think about the composition of this force. He does have some British soldiers. He's got some Australians and New Zealanders, some Anzacs. He's got some nationalist Chinese formations under the 14th Army. He's got Gurkhas. He loves the Gurkhas. That's why he wears his Gurkha hat. He commanded the Gurkhas, and he identifies with and relates to the Gurkhas. He has American troops in his formation. He has Indians. But remember, the Indians don't come in one flavor. There are Hindus, there are Sikhs, there are Muslims. And then he has East and West African troops. He has folks from the east side of Africa, Tanganyika, Uganda. He has folks from the west side of Africa, the Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast. This is really a polyglot formation. And he has got to make an army out of it, and that's his challenge. This is the directive, paraphrase, that he gets from Mountbatten. Mountbatten's the SEAC commander, the whole theater commander. He's the big guy, Admiral Mountbatten. He tells him, don't let an invasion of India happen, and I want you to get ready to take Burma over again. And I've given you this 14th Army. There's a couple of issues with that. And so Slim realizes that he's got a significant task in front of him. This is a very tall order, because the Japanese have never been defeated. They've been a steamroller going over everyone that they've faced thus far. So Slim identifies his key tasks here. He takes a look at what he's got to do to make this happen successfully. The first thing he's got to do is he has to build an army. Sounds pretty simple, but he has to build an army. This is a significant undertaking, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. He has to build an effective coalition with the United States in the person of Lieutenant General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Vinegar Joe did not get his name because of his Carnegie graduation certificate, so he can be a little difficult to work with. He knows that he needs Ord Wingate and his special operators, his irregular forces, to disrupt Japanese logistics. He sees logistics as kind of the center of gravity for this whole operation. If he can sustain his force and prevent the Japanese force from being sustained, he believes he can be successful. That's his vision here, and he needs this special operators to work. We'll talk about General Wingate a little bit. And the last thing he understands is that he must know who his enemy is. He's got to try to get inside his enemy's decision cycle. His enemy is Japanese Lieutenant General Reina Mutaguchi, and we'll talk about him in some detail as well. But those he sees as his four key tasks as he gets after this fight here with the Japanese. So the first thing he's got to do is he's got to build this army. Because they've been the last in the Allied priority for supplies, they don't have much stuff. And they can be pretty sure they're not going to get much stuff. And so he's got to figure out how to overcome the logistics shortfalls. But it's more than that. It's being able to move it. The terrain in this area is very forbidding. So he has to create a distribution network, and he has to find places where he can cache supplies. And this is going to work okay for him because he comes up with a box philosophy where when he's going to attack, he's going to tell his forces, if the Japanese attack you, form a box. Let them go around you, and we will supply you by air. And he uses air supply throughout his campaign that is upcoming very effectively. The other thing he understands is he must threaten the Japanese locks, and that's going to be a combination of things. But the priority is going to be on Wingate's forces to disrupt distribution, freedom of movement, and the ability's enemy to sustain itself. He knows he has to get after the health issues. He is losing 120 soldiers to disease for every one that he's losing in combat. These are losses that cannot be sustained. He understands also that this is all about field sanitation. This is about having conditions that do not allow disease to generate. And so what he does is he takes the onus for field sanitation off the medical staff where it had been, and he puts it on the shoulders of the commanders. And he tells the commanders, you're responsible for the health of your soldiers. And of course, they'd heard it all before. But after he relieved a couple of generals, people started to listen. And he saw a significant turnaround in the ability of soldiers to survive the health threats in the field. The other thing that he did was he moved to treating the soldiers forward. Don't evacuate them all the way back to India. I'll never see them again. I'm going to treat them forward and get them right back into their formation. It proves to be a very successful rationale and strategy. And the third thing that he learned was about morale. And he knew he needed to understand his troops. One of the things about Slim is he would go and visit the frontline units. This is a guy that had been injured 3 times. He knew about visiting frontline units. And when it came to the Southwest Asian forces, he could speak most of their languages, sometimes only in a rudimentary way, but he could speak some of those languages. The Urdu, the Pashtun, some of the Indian dialects. He could speak those and relate to them in their own language. He didn't speak any of the African languages, but he tried to, and he brought interpreters with him. He also understood that things like rations needed to be carefully thought out. They were being supplied by the Imperial General Staff. So the food was coming in as if it was feeding British soldiers from Manchester or London, which is great if you're from Manchester or London. But if you're an Indian army with Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims in your formation, giving them pork and beef is not a good way to start a relationship. So he worked hard on getting the right kinds of rations into his soldiers' mess hall so that they could eat the things that they were familiar with. One of the interesting asides here is he figured, he's an Englishman. He knows rice is rice. Well, it turns out rice isn't rice. There's many different kinds of rice, and depending on where in the world you're from, there's a right rice and a wrong rice. And he pushed his quartermaster very hard to get the correct rice for the different people. The folks from Africa didn't eat the same rice as the folks from Southwest Asia. Those were the little things that he did that started to make the folks believe that they were in a formation with somebody who was going to take care of them. This is very important because remember, they're from all over the place. He's got to glue this organization together. The second thing is he did relieve some non-performing commanders, and he made no secret of it. Didn't humiliate them, but he would relieve them, and the word would spread like wildfire through the organizations. The patch, the 14th patch, became hugely important to many of the people in the organization because they were very proud to have a patch. They never had a patch. Now we got a patch. It really had a great effect on the formation. He made sure they had the right amount of equipment to the best that he could do in the constrained environment. He provided training. What he had to do was get them over their fear of the Japanese. The Japanese have never lost. We can't beat the Japanese. You don't want to be like an army facing Napoleon in 1805 where you're already defeated before you even get to the field. That we want to get past that. Okay? So he puts them into these training regimens, and they get into the jungle, and they start to use the jungle a little bit and get familiar and comfortable in the jungle, and you see a significant increase in confidence. Then he goes after some quick wins. And what he does by this is he lets little forays, little patrols go out, and they find out, well, the Japanese guys are really not supermen. We can beat these fellas. And so they start to do that, and then the little wins become little larger wins, and little larger and little larger, until the confidence goes through the formation. And the myth of the Japanese Superman, before the 14th even goes into the fight, has already been broken. But they did have to overcome that fear, and he did it by limiting the goals and getting these quick wins. And so these were the things that he focused on. He could have focused on tactics. He could have focused on discipline. He could have focused on a lot of things. He focused on supply, health, and morale to bring this polyglot force together. His second key task was to come to an arrangement with Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell. General Stilwell was a significant presence in this theater. He was a China expert. He spoke the language. He'd done multiple tours in China. He had the trust and confidence of General Marshal and, by extension, President Roosevelt. He really was a master of the area. He was not pleasant to work with, is the general assessment. He really hated British officers. He thought they were stodgy, stuffy, incompetent, and Stilwell was a soldier, and he just had no time for somebody that was walking around like a martinet, and he kind of classified most of the British leaders in that way. It is very interesting to look at all the different hats that Stilwell had to wear. I only steal the very best slides. I stole this one from Jeff Babb. This is a really good slide because it shows all the different things that Stilwell had to do. Stilwell was Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. That's pretty significant. Stilwell was the commander of United States Army forces in the China-Burma-India theater. Stilwell was the deputy to Admiral Mountbatten. So, in effect, he was the second highest ranking person in the theater. And he was he commanded the Chinese army that was left in India, the parts of the Chinese army in India he commanded. And he was the commander of the Northern Force. And you'll notice there's a dotted line there because it is this Northern Force that has to be attached to a British element to affect the campaign, the SEAC campaign. And this is interesting because we've already discussed, well, I did, that Stilwell does not have a very high opinion of British officers. Interestingly, he had grown to develop a great respect for Slim. And there's an interesting quote where they're in a very contentious meeting, and they're trying to figure out how to get Stilwell to behave, how to get Stilwell to be part of the formation, how to get Stilwell to play nice in a sandbox, which is not in General Stilwell's DNA. And then all of a sudden, he throws the grenade into the room, says, "I am prepared to come under the General Slim's command." And no one was ready for that. Slim and Stilwell got up, they left the room, they went back to Stilwell's local headquarters, and an hour later they came out and they had the plan. And they said, the 1940s version of, "We got this." And they did have this. And they had a relationship that worked throughout the war. And so what he was able to do, Slim's personality and leadership style was able to build a bridge with a contentious U.S. soldier that had no intention of ever working with the British. He's a bridge builder. Okay. He also has to work with unique individuals. And General Ord Wingate is a unique individual. General Wingate was, he had some issues with authority. He would tell generals what they could. He was very disrespectful and that kind of thing. He got fired a number of times. Before he moved to the Middle East, into this theater to work with Slim and Wavell, he was on the verge of suicide. He had actually been stopped in an act of suicide at a hospital, but he was brilliant. This Wingate understood irregular warfare like few others. He worked very well in coordination with Merrill of Merrill's Marauders. But what he understood was he could get into the enemy's rear area and disrupt communication, disrupt sustainment, and be able to affect the outcome of the battle by going in through the back door. Wingate had his force were called Chindits. They were named after these statues that used to guard the temples. The Chindits were the fellows that would go in and they would go behind the enemy lines, much like the Rangers, the Special Forces today. And Slim understood the value of this officer. Slim put up with General Wingate, and General Wingate delivered. So the bottom line is that was another mutually beneficial relationship that was built by Slim. This relationship was not established by Wingate, Wingate had problems with authority. Slim had problems with the Japanese rear area, and he needed to get this guy on his side, and he made that happen. So that was key task number 3. The fourth key task that he had understood was that he had to know what General Mo Taguchi was going to do. What do we know about General Mo Taguchi? We know that he was a very successful commander in the field. We know that he commanded the 15th Japanese Army. He was very aggressive. He was ruthless. And he thought his soldiers were as expendable as the enemy soldiers. Didn't care what it cost. He would send them into the battle if he thought there was any chance at all of winning. Pyrrhic victories, he had a number of those. Excuse me. General Mo Taguchi is anxious to get into India. He announces that we are now invincible, and we're ready to go to India. And he announces this in a way that everybody heard, to include Slim. So you kind of know what they're going to do. The next chart I'm going to show you is what he does. Mo Taguchi's plan, he has a diversionary plan called Hago and a main plan called Ugo, and the map is just not very good, so I'm warning you up front. What you can see on this map is Hago happens in Arakan, and it's a diversionary attack. The idea is to draw off as many of the British as you can here. The main attack is at Kohima and Imphal, and it is very successful. It gets to Kohima and Imphal. The only problem is Mo Taguchi is convinced that like every single other time he's faced the British or any of these allied armies, they're going to crumble, and they're just going to fall apart in the face of the Imperial Japanese Army. This time it doesn't happen. This time, Kohima and Imphal are laid siege, and they are successfully repelled by the 15th Corps. And what they do is they end up dropping, they're using airdrops to keep these folks resupplied in there. But it holds. At the same time this is happening, our friend Wingate's forces here are running roughshod over the Japanese rear area. And that sets the stage for what happens next, which is the 14th Army's attack. At the same time, you'll notice that Stilwell's forces operate toward Myitkyina. I didn't say that right, Jeff. You'll help me later. Say it again? Myitkyina. The 14th Army does two things. It goes straight down in the vicinity of the Irrawaddy. But you remember earlier we mentioned that Rangoon to Mandalay was the Burma Road supply line. But after the Japanese invaded Burma, it was also their supply line. And what the 14th Army did was sever it. And what Slim had figured out early on was that the Irrawaddy Valley, the valley of this Irrawaddy River, once we get across the river, it's going to be a beautiful area for tanks. And the tanks went crazy over this area. There weren't a lot of them, but there were enough to overcome the Japanese resistance. The 15th Army is utterly destroyed by the 14th Army. This is getting confusing. The Japanese 15th Army is absolutely destroyed during this attack. And that leads us to this. Because remember, the whole idea was we had to get the Japanese out of Burma so that we could protect India. That's what the British folks are thinking. The Americans are thinking we need to open up the supply line to China. Now we're not doing that from Rangoon through Mandalay and into China anymore. Now we're building this Ledo Road, which runs across the top from India into China. It's only 130 miles, take or leave, but that's what it looks like. And it took a long time to build that road, but they were able to do that. So when I think about Slim, and when I talk to officers at Leavenworth about Slim, some of the things that we think about are the ability for Slim to understand what he thought his key tasks were and to make sure that everybody understood what they were. He communicated this. He visited the units in the field. He frequently was able to speak with them in their own language, at least to a limited degree. He developed a relationship. What he did was he imparted trust and earned it in return. And the folks in the 14th Army became very proud of the fact that they were in the 14th Army. Slim epitomized competence, always, tactical brilliance in this attack plan, but he was also humble. He always took his mistakes and said, yeah, I did that. I made this mistake. He wouldn't let his subordinates take the rap for a mistake. He owned the mistakes. But he also built these long relationships. There's a number of stories about, as he was moving through the ranks from captain to major lieutenant colonel, relationships that he had built earlier with other officers enabled his success to some degree. And then, of course, being able to build the coalition of that polyglot 14th Army that we showed you, that were from multiple continents, multiple faiths, multiple languages, multiple cultures, and make them all row the boat in the same direction. That is a feat of leadership. And finally, what I take away from Slim is that really the best lessons that he took away from his experiences were from his defeats. His defeats left a mark. But you would wonder, as a Corps commander, if you were defeated twice decisively, why would they turn around and give you the command of an army? Somebody saw something in Slim, and it was money well placed. And that is my pitch on Slim. So thank you very much for your time.
Hello. Could you come back to that slide you had on the Ledo Road?
Yeah, it'd be better if I went to the map.
Yeah, that one. Out of curiosity, and I have no idea what the answer is, who built that? Was that a Corps of Engineers project, or was that a mishmash of various national...
I'm going to wait for Jeff to come at me, but I'll tell you that it was built by a Corps of Engineer officer, forgot his name, but it was built by everybody else. It was led, the effort was led by the engineers, but the manual labor was provided by many people. Mostly Chinese? Jeff?
The guy's name was Peck.
That's right, okay. That's a heck of a road. Sir.
One of the things that impressed me about Slim was his ability to get along with Lord Louis Mountbatten, because Mountbatten was he was not particularly loved in the Navy because of the fact he was a royal, and he was a commander, and all of a sudden he's commanding people who were admirals when he was a junior officer. But Slim apparently got on quite well with him and spoke highly of him when the Navy people, most of them, detested him. I think that's a real part of his success, of getting along with somebody like that.
It was, and you know what's even, we've already touched on this a little bit, but what makes it so much more remarkable, in my opinion, is the fact that Mountbatten looked down his nose at Slim at the first, because he was low-born, and whether he carried a prejudice because he was Catholic or not, I can't say, but he definitely considered Slim low-born, and at first didn't want to really deal with him. But Slim made the relationship happen, as he did with Stilwell, as he did with Wingate. And we see this over and over again throughout his career. It's not an accident, it's a pattern that you point out. So, yes.
What's an approximate size of the 14th Army?
It varied. The 14th Army, the forces were coming and going. You know, the Americans weren't in it the whole time. The Chinese divisions were attached and not attached. I don't think it ever went above 40,000. Do you have a...
5 or 6 divisions, so 40 to 60,000. So he was able to, with all this coming and going, he was able to see the big picture.
Yeah, he had a great vision, and he had a great campaign plan. And so it was very important that the forces come and go on the schedule. And for the most part, they did. There were a couple of hiccups. Chiang Kai-shek was notoriously cautious at times, and so that happened to them once. And Stilwell needed some forces quickly that he took away for good reason. And later on, Slim said, I would have done the same thing. But he had a very phased plan, and if you stuck with the plan, then it was okay.
Slim picked the commanders of the various groups.
I know he picked his major subordinate commanders. I'm not sure how far his vote went down below that. But he always was able to prejudice things. He made sure that the Gurkhas were always at the front of on the pointy end of the spear. because he had undying faith in the Gurkhas that was well-deserved. And he had great faith in the 17th Division. He had great faith in the 7th Division, which had the tanks, and he had great. There were favorite units that he had that he would minimize his risk by throwing those units into the fight.
In John Master's book, The Road Past Mandalay, does that road past, does that refer to this road here, the Ledo Road, or does that refer to the Burma Road that simply goes north of Mandalay? I don't know that.
The road to Mandalay is the Burma Road, yeah.
It's 500 miles from Mandalay to China.
Are we good? Oh, sir?
The C-47, C-46 flights, supply flights in CBI were from where to where?
There were airfields in India. Now, I'm going to defer to Jeff on this. They did a lot of airdropping, and then they would fly from one place and then return. Is that a good map there? You know, I have a bigger.
Everybody thinks the hump was a north to south plane. It was mostly a west to east plane.
Yeah.
You go to northern India and you draw a line to Kunming, China, that's where the route went. And the key was to get the Japanese further south and their airfields further south so that you could move the American airplanes further to the east where the mountains were less high. So in the bad days when the Japanese owned most of Burma, you had to fly much more kind of north to south and then east. But as the north was taken, you could move forces. The other thing that happened is the Allied Air Force gets better and better and better, 43, 44, 45, and the Japanese Air Force is getting worse and worse and worse. So the two things together, the building of the Ledo Road, which doesn't go into China until February of 45. So that they fly the hump a long time. But it's better to fly the hump on the eastern side. The further east you can go, the safer it is.
And airdropping also became much better as the war went on. And Slim, well, I didn't spend much time on this, but Slim was a big believer in defensive boxes. He would let, because of the way his formation was set up, he would tell folks, his subordinate commanders, to set up a defensive box. Don't worry, I'll get ammo and food to you. Just set up the box there so that you cannot be overrun. And there's even a famous battle in the First Archon called the Battle of the Admin Box, where by a significantly larger Japanese force, this boxed, almost like the old British square, was able to repel this significantly larger force. So it's a combination of things. But being able to get food and ammunition by airdrop into the forces that were surrounded was a good part of the 14th Army's success. Sir.
How did Slim's post-war career go?
Slim's post-war career. He became the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He followed Montgomery as the chief of the Imperial General Staff. And again, I don't want to get into a Montgomery-Slim thing, but Montgomery took it right after the war, and Slim was pulled out of retirement to take the job. So somebody really wanted him, a fellow named Churchill. But anyway, he was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. He later became the Governor General Viceroy of Australia. I forgot what the right title is. But he became the administrator, the royal administrator in Australia. And full disclosure here, there were allegations late in his career that he denied vehemently, that he had been involved in some child molestation things. The accusations, to the best of my knowledge, were not founded, but they were enough to tarnish the end of his life. Sir.
When he's discussed in the college,
when he's discussed in the college, what are like the key takeaways from his experience and everything, and how are those applied today?
This is SLIM is used, we use SLIM in the Department of Military History for a lot of different things. But this case study, this SLIM case study, is used by the Department of Command and Leadership. And what they're trying to show there is the ability to command a coalition, the idea of gaining commitment of the people in your formation, vice trying to lead by compliance. In other words, getting people to want to do what you want to do as opposed to doing it because you're making them do it. And SLIM does that in very good order. And so that's kind of the focus of that. But there are many other facets of that we bring into it. And you know, one of the things that I like to talk about is SLIM's tactical brilliance. He was a brilliant tactical leader and doesn't get enough credit for that, in my opinion. Sir?
Regarding tactics, what about SLIM made him not fall for that feint by the Japanese general to the left?
To the Arakan.
Right.
He understood, in my opinion, he understood that the Arakan had no strategic significance. It would have a year and a half earlier, when the Japanese Navy was still able to influence the fight. But the Japanese Navy had become essentially moot at that point. And so the feint to the Arakan, SLIM clearly recognized that it was all about nothing. There was nothing the Japanese could do with the Arakan. There was no resource base there. There was no way to resupply them. And the other thing too is Mo Taguchi had telegraphed his punch. He said he's going into India, and you're not going to go in through the Arakan. You're going to go in through Kohima and Imphal. Those are the two gateway cities to India. So.
You talked a little bit about you talked about SLIM. You talked about Wingate a little bit. Could you say a little bit about Merrill's Marauders?
I can say a little bit about Merrill's Marauders. Let me get the right map. The Merrill's Marauders were supporting the Stilwells-led attack to Myitkyina. It's okay, Jeff. I'll get it. But this was an important road junction. It was an important transportation hub for the Japanese. And Merrill's Marauders were the ones that were a big part of that attack, supporting it in the same way that Wingate supported. But he was working, to my understanding, more to the flanks to enable the advance to continue. Is there anything you want to add to that? Or?
It was the only U.S. ground combat force in the China-Burma-India theater. It is followed by the Mars Force, which is the 124th Cavalry Texas National Guard that joins with the leftovers of the remnants, because essentially Stilwell fought Merrill's Marauders far past the time that they should have been relieved and brought home. One of our compatriots, Dr. Gary Bjorgi, has written a wonderful little pamphlet on that. The other thing is that this fight for Myitkyina is mostly about a whole British division, the 36th, and about 2 Chinese armies, out of what should have been more than 12 Chinese armies that Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't commit. So it is a very, very difficult mess. But the Merrill's Marauders, which is what, 3,500 folks, is a very, very small but very well put into the newspaper part of the American Army. But this is a Chinese and British fight.
Sure.
There are stories that perhaps apocryphal that Ord Wingate occasionally had staff meetings where he wore nothing but his pith helmet and was completely naked. And yet he still had the confidence of this remarkable field marshal. Are those stories true, do you think? Have they ever been?
Wingate was a very eccentric man.
Yes.
Can I leave it at that? But a very effective combat leader.
In terms of the aviation picture, does Claire Chenault and the Flying Tigers at any point in time ever have any bearing on this? Number one. And number two, if they go away fairly early, does the aviation picture essentially come under American command and control, obviously operating for Slim and Mountbatten, but how does the air picture fit in there, or do we know that?
Stilwell commanded all the American forces, and almost all the airplanes were American,
Okay.
and we had air superiority. I don't think Chenault was part of this, was he?
At this map right here, he is.
Oh, yeah, but that's early on. That's in
It's
42.
early on piece,
Yeah.
But then they go back up into China. The thing is that Slim and the Brits will slowly build this force in India, and as planes become available, they stop going to the Middle East, they stop going to Italy, they stop going to Europe. The amount of planes that can be built by the United States and the number of pilots that are trained, there's a slow buildup. So when Slim comes back in here, 44, 45, it is an ever-increasing air capability of the Allies.
And they don't face a threat. It's not a significant threat anyway.
Can you offer anything about the communications that Slim, the communication system? It's not like we have today with all these nice little radios and satellites and so forth. How did he keep this thing together?
It's funny that you mention that, because they had radios, but the terrain was such that the radios were excess weight in many cases. And they did an awful lot of physical dispatches, writing out orders and dispatches and visiting. Slim was great for visiting the battlefield and giving orders out at that time. But the radio communications were very, very difficult in this theater. And once they got in the Irrawaddy Plain, the radios could start working. But until they got down into that plain, down in here, they really weren't using radios too much. Sir?
Thank you. It's about the polyglot. Is that how you pronounce it? The polyglot, all these different armies coming together. How common is that in the history? I've heard of like one other, like Hannibal did it that way, and like is it like something?
We try to build we try to build coalition armies whenever we fight, of course. You know, the days of national armies in the 19th century are probably largely gone at this point. But the force that they put together, when I say it was polyglot, they were all different, but they all had some connection to the British Empire, part of the Commonwealth. There was a connection there, so it wasn't that it wasn't like the coalitions in Iraq, for example, that were political coalitions that put together for different reasons by statesmen. All of these nations had a connection. That's not to say the Americans are part of the thing. They're not, but the Americans became part of Slim's formation at times, and then they were not. So it's interesting just putting them together. But I know that. Dr. Gerges and I study the war in the peninsula, where Wellington put together disparate forces as well: Spanish forces, Portuguese forces, English forces, to fight the common French enemy. So, I mean, the idea of these coalition armies is not new, for sure. And you mentioned Hannibal, of course. Mm-hmm. Are we good? Well, thanks an awful lot, but hold on, I'm not finished. But wait, there's more. Not really. There are a bunch of great books out there, and someone's. I see a copy of Defeat into Victory right here. There's some really great books out there. I would push real hard on Lewin's biography. It's very good. It was an authorized biography, and it's very good. And the final thing I have for you is next month, where our very own Dr. Jonathan Abel will talk about Maurice de Saxe. And please come back, Jonathan Abel. And so please. we encourage you to come back to hear that one as well. And again, thank you very much for your time. We do appreciate you coming. Thank you.